Welcome back to Amazing Stories. Today we bring you the incredible story of a figure who made history, Al Capone. Al Capone, the king of organized crime, is a name that conjures up power, violence, and crime. Considered the most famous gangster of all time, his presence dominated the Prohibition era in the 1920s in the United States. Nicknamed Scarface, his life has been immortalized in movies, books, and documentaries. He is the origin of the modern mafia stereotype. But how did he go from being just a street thug in Brooklyn to becoming the kingpin of organized crime? Today, we'll explore his rise, his reign, and his inevitable downfall. In 1899, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, New York, Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born, the son of Italian immigrants Gabriel and Teresa Capone, who had come to the United States in search of a better future. His father was a barber and his mother a seamstress, both struggling to support the family in a country that didn't always welcome newcomers. Brooklyn at that time was a tough place, marked by poverty and crime. From a young age, Al Capone understood that in his world there were only two paths: be a victim or become a predator. At 14, after being expelled from school for attacking a teacher, he found his real education on the streets, where he formed his first gang, the Navy Street Gang. It wasn't just a group of friends, but a way to protect young Italians from the Irish neighborhood kids who harassed them. Capone soon stood up not only as a fighter, but as a leader with great charisma and an ability to command respect, skills that would stay with him throughout his life. At 19, his life took a turn when he married Mary Coughlin, a young Irish woman he met at a bar. Shortly after, their only son, Albert Francis Capone, was born. However, family happiness did not guarantee financial stability. With no education or job opportunities, Capone knew the streets would be his only way to survive. New York's criminal underworld would soon open the doors to his dark future. The nights in New York were not just about noise and fun. In the speakeasies, the real forces of criminal power operated, and Al Capone was about to dive into that dark world. It was there that he met major mafia figures like Johnny Torrio, Frankie Yale, and Lucky Luciano, men who controlled bootlegging, illegal gambling, and crime in the city. Capone was quickly recruited by Frankie Yale, who took him under his wing and put him to work at one of the most dangerous places in New York, the Harvard, a bar, brothel, and headquarters for organized crime. His job was clear: collect debts, intimidate delinquent customers, and oversee the profits from prostitution to prevent theft. The Harvard was no ordinary place. There, fights, murders, and settling of scores were daily occurrences. And Capone soon found himself caught up in that violence, which would leave a permanent mark on him, both physically and on his reputation. That's how the nickname Scarface was born. It was during this period that Al Capone received the scar that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The story goes that one night, Capone tried to flirt with a young woman at the bar. When he whispered something in her ear, his words were not well received. The woman, outraged, went to find her brother, a gangster named Frank Gal Lucio. Drunk and furious, Gal Lucio attacked Capone with a bottle opener, leaving him with two deep cuts on his face, one of them running from his ear to his mouth. From that day on, Capone's face was never the same. Although he tried to hide the scar throughout his life, which he considered a disfigurement, many saw it as a symbol of respect, a mark that cemented his legend as Scarface. Even though Capone was becoming a key figure in organized crime, there was a moment when he considered leaving that world behind. After marrying Mary Coughlin, with whom he had his son Albert Francis Capone, and with a family to support, Al Capone began to imagine a different future. He decided to leave New York and move to Baltimore, where he got a job at an accounting firm. Few people know that Capone had a remarkable talent for numbers, which allowed him to develop skills that would later be crucial in his rise within organized crime. However, his life away from crime didn't last long. In 1920, a tragic event changed his life. His father, Gabriel Capone, died of a heart attack. Devastated, Capone returned to Brooklyn and reconnected with his old criminal ties, this time for good. In New York, Capone had already made a name for himself in the criminal underworld. His aggressive temperament earned him respect, but also many enemies. It was said that he didn't hesitate to use violence, even to kill if necessary. According to testimonies from that time, Capone is believed to have killed a prostitute who stole money from him and also eliminated a friend who refused to pay a debt at the bar where he worked. However, his impulsive behavior didn't go unnoticed, and soon Frankie Yale and Lucky Luciano started to see him as a problem. Capone attracted too much attention, something the mafia couldn't afford. That's how Johnny Torrio, one of the most powerful crime bosses in Chicago, decided to get Capone out of New York. He needed someone he could trust to handle his business, and Capone was the ideal person. So, Al Capone boarded a train bound for Chicago, not knowing that this city would not only open the doors to power for him, but would also turn him into a legend. In 1921, Prohibition had turned alcohol smuggling into one of the most lucrative industries in the country. Johnny Torrio controlled one of the largest bootlegging networks in Chicago. It was in this context that Al Capone, accompanied by his family, arrived in the city with the sole intention of learning how organized crime worked and rising through its ranks. There was no one better than Torrio to teach him. Torrio was not your typical mobster. He was methodical, calculating, and understood that power was achieved not only through violence, but also with strategy. Under his tutelage, Capone learned that organized crime required both intelligence and brutality. Lessons that would shape his future and Capone's rise within the Chicago Mafia. He started at the very bottom, running brothels, controlling gambling, and making sure the money flowed smoothly. But his loyalty and efficiency allowed him to rise quickly. He soon became a bartender and head of security at one of Torrio's most important bars, a place where illegal alcohol flowed freely, but where fights and murders were part of daily life. Capone proved to be a businessman with a knack for crime. Thanks to bootlegging, prostitution, extortion, and gambling, his fortune began to grow. Under Torrio's leadership, Chicago's criminal empire expanded like never before. Brothels and speakeasies were thriving. Money was flowing, and the mafia was more powerful than ever. But in 1923, everything would change. William Dever was elected mayor of Chicago, and his mission was clear: to put an end to organized crime. Dever ordered the closure of hundreds of speakeasies and gambling houses, forcing Torrio and Capone to make a drastic decision: move their operations to the outskirts of the city, to a place called Cicero. The takeover of Cicero. With Chicago under pressure from the new mayor, William Edward, Torrio and Capone needed to expand their criminal empire. Their new target, the city of Cicero. Located on the outskirts of Chicago, Cicero offered less police oversight and a great opportunity to set up bootlegging and illegal gambling operations. But to pull it off, they needed political influence. The plan was simple: make sure their candidate, Joseph D. Clegna, won the local elections. Without his victory, the organized crime business would be at risk. To make it happen, Capone mobilized his people and brought in reinforcements, his brothers Frank and Ralph Capone. March 31st, 1924, Election Day. The streets of Cicero turned into a battlefield. Capone's gangsters used fists, guns, and threats to make sure people voted for their candidate. Voters were escorted to the polls, forced to mark D. Clegna's name under threat of death. Panic took over the city. Terrified, the citizens turned to Judge Edmund K. Uretsky, who ordered the immediate intervention of the police. 70 plainclothes officers were sent in to stop the chaos, but when they arrived, the situation erupted into violence. When the undercover police got out of their vehicles, they saw Frank Capone trying to draw his weapon. What happened next was a massacre. Without hesitation, the officers fired in cold blood, riddling Frank Capone with bullets until their magazines were empty. His death was brutal and instantaneous. Despite the chaos, the efforts of Capone and Torrio were not in vain. Joseph D. Clegna won the election, ensuring that organized crime could operate without restrictions in Cicero. However, the victory came at a high price. Al Capone lost his brother Frank in the battle. His death left a deep mark on him, and for the first time, the king of crime felt the weight of loss, along with his rivalry with the Irish gangs. After establishing their dominance in Cicero, Capone and Torrio expanded their empire with a new betting house that generated nearly $500,000 in its first years. A fortune for that time. Soon, Cicero had more than 150 gambling houses, all operating under the control of the Italian mafia and serving a clientele hungry for alcohol and illegal betting. But they weren't the only ones who wanted to control the business. The trafficking. Of alcohol had become an extremely lucrative market, and the Italian Americans weren't the only players. The Irish gangs that had operated in Chicago long before them were not willing to lose their territory without a fight. The war between Italians and Irish. The inevitable happened. The Irish gangs and the Italian mafia went to war. Led by Dean O'Banion, the Irish attacked Torrio and Capone's businesses, trying to regain control of the alcohol trade. Their goal was clear: eliminate Johnny Torrio and take control. In a ruthless attempt to get rid of Torrio, they organized an attack, but they failed. Torrio managed to survive, which gave him the chance to strike back. On November 10, 1924, revenge arrived. O'Banion was killed in his own flower shop, taking 2 shots to the chest and 2 to the neck. The ones responsible were 3 of Torrio's men, Frankie Yale, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi. But it wouldn't end there. The Irish revenge was coming. With O'Banion out of the way, Torrio and Capone thought the war was over, but the Irish mob wasn't going to give up that easily. Two Irish gangsters, Himmy Weiss and Bugs Moran, swore to avenge O'Banion's death. In January 1925, they planned another hit on Torrio. This time, the attack nearly succeeded. Torrio was seriously wounded and came close to dying. The attack was enough to convince him that Chicago had become too dangerous for him. He decided to retire from crime, leaving full control of the organization in Al Capone's hands. Scarface's response. Although Capone didn't seek immediate revenge for the attempt on Torrio's life, he knew the Irish were still a threat. The first target on his list, Jamie Weiss. To carry out the hit, he assembled a team of 5 killers, including Frank Nitti, Anthony Accardo, Frank Diamond, Albert Anselmi, and John Scalise. On October 11, 1926, after watching Weiss's movements for days, they finally found the perfect opportunity. As Weiss and 3 of his bodyguards left his store, they were brutally stabbed by Capone's men. Weiss died on the spot, leaving the Irish without their fiercest leader. If he eliminated Moran, Capone would have a monopoly on alcohol trafficking in Chicago. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Chicago, 1927. William H. Thompson is re-elected as mayor, and with him returns the corruption that allows the mafia to operate with greater freedom. For Al Capone, this meant a golden opportunity. Back at his headquarters, after years of police pressure, Capone had a clear goal: eliminate his last obstacle to total control of alcohol trafficking in Chicago. That obstacle had a name: Bugs Moran. Moran and Capone had been waging a fierce war for years. The streets of Chicago were covered in blood. Murders multiplied and the violence was out of control. But Capone had a plan to end the dispute once and for all. February 14, 1929, the day of the execution. While Al Capone was relaxing at his villa in Florida, his men in Chicago were about to carry out the most infamous hit in the history of organized crime. Following Capone's direct orders, a group of hitmen disguised as police officers arrived at a liquor warehouse controlled by Moran. They ordered the 7 men present to line up against the wall. Thinking it was just a routine raid, Moran's men didn't resist. But this time, there would be no bribes and no escape. The massacre. Without warning, the hitmen opened fire. The bodies fell to the ground, torn apart by a hail of machine gun bullets. In a matter of seconds, Bugs Moran's warehouse turned into a slaughterhouse. But there was a problem. Bugs Moran was not among the victims. By an incredible coincidence, Moran had arrived late at the warehouse and, seeing the police enter, decided to stay away. This simple delay saved his life. The end of an era. Although the St. Valentine's Day Massacre didn't eliminate Bugs Moran, its impact was devastating. Moran never recovered from the loss of his organization and, over time, faded into irrelevance. He ended up committing petty robberies and was eventually arrested for a bank robbery. He died in prison in 1957. For Al Capone, the war was over. With all his rivals out of the way, total control of organized crime in Chicago had never been so close. Al Capone at the Atlantic City Conference. It was May 1929. The most powerful organized crime bosses in the United States gathered in Atlantic City. The goal of this historic summit was clear: to reduce tensions between mafia families and avoid wars that could affect their businesses. Among the attendees were Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Willie Moretti, and of course, Al Capone. But, unlike other mobsters, Capone was not well received. Since the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the press had made him the face of organized crime. Too much attention, too many headlines. Some bosses considered his presence a problem and thought it would be best to get rid of him. At the meeting, he was warned to keep a low profile or face the consequences. Capone, always a strategist, decided to take the warning seriously, but in an unexpected way. A brief stint in prison. For Capone, the best way to disappear from the radar was to do something that, well, no one expected: let himself be arrested voluntarily. Just 16 hours after the Atlantic City conference, Capone orchestrated his own imprisonment. He reached an agreement with the Philadelphia police to be arrested for illegal possession of weapons. His goal was simple: to cool off the media attention and avoid the growing pressure from the FBI. The sentence was light, 1 year in prison, but with the help of his lawyers, the sentence was reduced considerably. When he got out, things had changed. The public no longer saw him as an untouchable gangster, but as a dangerous criminal. Although he went back to business, his image was, well, pretty damaged. Scarface tried to restore his image. Aware of the negative impact his reputation was having, Capone tried to reinvent his image. Yes, he became a public figure, showing off his more extravagant side. He was a sports fanatic and frequently attended boxing matches, baseball games, and horse races. At these events, it wasn't unusual to see him accompanied by politicians and public figures who didn't hesitate to be seen with him in public. In his free time, he enjoyed theater, opera, jazz, poker, and swimming. He was a man of excess, but also a master in the art of self-promotion. The press adored him. Every time he appeared, it was news, and little by little, the myth of Al Capone began to grow. However, his reputation, which had been severely damaged after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, continued to generate rejection in many sectors of society. To counter this, Capone decided to reinvent himself, this time as a benefactor of the people, helping the poor to improve his image. Cornered by the government and with his public image under siege, Capone tried another strategy: to become a man of the people. Let's take a short break. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining us. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these stories, I invite you to subscribe so we can keep sharing amazing tales like this one. Thank you, and let's continue. At its peak, Capone's criminal empire generated about $120 million a year, which would be equivalent to $15.5 billion today. Money wasn't a problem for Capone, but his reputation was. To improve his image, he opened a soup kitchen during the Great Depression of 1929, where thousands received free meals. For many, Capone was a savior. However, his goal was to build the image of a modern-day Robin Hood. The strategy worked for a while, but after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Capone became the face of organized crime. Neither his charity nor his popularity could save his image. The press and public opinion already saw him as a ruthless killer. But there was a problem: Capone was untouchable. His network of corruption and bribery reached every level of the city. The police, the judges, the politicians, everyone had a price. At his peak, his army of thugs was more powerful than the law enforcement itself. On top of that, there was no concrete evidence to incriminate him. Bootlegging, extortion, prostitution, illegal gambling, and even murders. Everyone knew he was guilty, but no one could prove it. Eliot Ness and the Untouchables. The government needed a different strategy. That's when Eliot Ness, an agent from the Treasury Department, came onto the scene. Together with his team, the Untouchables, Ness launched a campaign to dismantle Capone's operations, but even they, with all their determination, only managed to slightly hinder the gangster's business. In 1931, Wilson discovered irrefutable evidence of Capone's illegal income. A simple betting record revealed that the mobster was receiving huge sums of money, enough to incriminate him for tax evasion, the trial of the century. On June 5, 1931, Wilson discovered irrefutable evidence, betting records that showed undeclared income. Capone was charged with tax fraud that very same day. During the trial in October, he tried to bribe the jury, but the authorities switched out all the jurors at the last minute. After 8 hours of deliberation, Capone was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in prison, a harsh sentence for that time. At first, in Cook County Jail, his life was relatively comfortable thanks to his influence, but his health began to deteriorate due to advanced syphilis. When he was transferred to the Atlanta Penitentiary, all the comforts disappeared. His mental health quickly collapsed. In 1934, Capone was sent to the newly opened Alcatraz prison, where the isolation was absolute. Without privileges or contacts, his illness worsened until he completely lost his mind. He was released years later due to his critical condition and spent his final days at his Florida villa, living like a 12-year-old child, unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of a heart attack at the age of 48. In one of his last reflections, he admitted that he thought prohibition was unfair and that his life had taken a dark path in pursuit of wealth. From the poor neighborhoods of Brooklyn to ruling over crime in Chicago, Capone lived out the darkest version of the American dream. His fortune eventually surpassed $1 billion when adjusted to today's value. Although he dominated Chicago, to other mafia bosses he was just a loud criminal who attracted too much attention. Even so, outside the criminal world, Capone became an eternal icon, immortalized by Hollywood as the face of gangsterism. And so we end the story of Al Capone, the man who built an empire with blood and corruption and was ultimately consumed by his own excesses. See you on a new adventure. Thank you for joining us on Amazing Stories.